The wind came down from the Absaroka Range like the breath of something ancient and hungry. It was the third week of February, 1841, and Thomas Brennan could feel winter's grip tightening around his isolated trading post in what would one day become northwestern Wyoming. But it wasn't the cold that worried him most that morning. It was the color of his gums. He'd seen it before, the pale, bloodless look, the slight give when he pressed his tongue against them. In another month, maybe two, they'd start to bleed. Then the teeth would loosen. Then came the weakness that turned a man's legs to water, made every step feel like climbing a mountain. Scurvy, the silent killer of the winter trap line, more deadly than any grizzly, more certain than any Blackfoot war party. Thomas stood in his storehouse, a low-roofed structure he'd dug partially into the hillside for insulation, and surveyed what remained of his winter provisions. Venison and elk, dried and smoked, hung from the rafters, cornmeal in sealed barrels, beans, salt pork, all the staples a man needed to survive in the high country. But survival wasn't the same as health, and Thomas knew it. His body was crying out for something his storehouse couldn't provide, something green, something alive. His eyes fell on the corner where, 3 months earlier, he'd carefully stored his harvest of wild berries, service berries, chokecherries, wild raspberries, and currants. He'd spent the better part of August and September gathering them, knowing that come winter they'd be worth more than gold. The native peoples had taught him that. The Shoshone and Crow women he'd traded with over the years, they understood something the white trappers often learned too late. Fresh fruit in winter wasn't a luxury, it was medicine. But what Thomas saw in that corner made his heart sink like a stone dropped through river ice. The berries were gone. Not eaten, not stolen. Ruined. He'd done everything the way he'd been taught, everything the old-timers said to do. He'd dried his berries on flat rocks in the sun, the way his mother had dried apples back in Pennsylvania. He'd spread them thin, turned them daily, made sure they shriveled into hard little pellets before storing them in leather pouches. It was the standard method, the accepted wisdom. Dry them hard enough, the thinking went, and they'll last the winter. But they hadn't lasted. The leather pouches he now lifted were stiff with frost, and when he poured their contents into his palm, what came out bore little resemblance to food. The dried berries had turned dark and hard as pebbles, their flavor leached away, their texture like chewing bark. Worse, many had developed a gray-white fuzz of mold, despite the cold. He'd checked them in December, and they'd seemed fine. But something had gone wrong in the deep cold of January. Condensation, maybe, freezing and thawing at the wrong times, moisture getting trapped in the leather despite his best efforts. Thomas tried to chew one of the dried service berries. It crumbled to dust in his mouth, bitter and faintly rotten. He spat it out and felt a wave of despair wash over him. 4 more months until spring. 4 more months until the first shoots of wild onion and the young leaves of dock would push through the thawing earth. 4 more months of nothing but meat and meal and the slow march toward scurvy. He'd seen men die from it, seen their minds go before their bodies, confusion and paranoia setting in as the disease ate away at them from the inside. Jacques Moreau, 2 winters past, had been found dead in his cabin up on the Bighorn River. When the spring trappers finally reached him, his teeth were scattered around his bedding like corn kernels, and his legs were so swollen and discolored they looked like someone else's limbs altogether. The man had starved to death with a storehouse full of food because his body couldn't process that food without the vital elements the berries would have provided. Thomas wasn't going to end up like Jacques. He couldn't. He had a young Shoshone wife now, Winter Moon, and she was carrying their first child. She was staying with her people for the winter, as was customary, but she'd return in spring. He had to be here, alive and well, to greet her. But looking at those ruined berries, Thomas felt the weight of his miscalculation. The dried berries had seemed like such a sure thing. Everyone dried their fruit. It was how you preserved things. Heat and air drove out the moisture, and without moisture, nothing could rot. Simple, logical. the way it had always been done. Except it hadn't worked. Thomas walked outside into the brutal cold, needing to clear his head. The snow was hip-deep in the drifts, and the sky was that hard crystalline blue that meant the temperature would drop even further once the sun went down. He could see his breath forming ice crystals in the air before him. At this altitude, in this cold, everything became brittle. Wood split at the wrong angle, metal tools snapped if dropped, and apparently dried berries turned to worthless dust. He thought about the other trappers scattered across these mountains, men like himself, living in isolation for months at a time. How many of them were facing the same slow deterioration? How many had trusted the old methods and were now paying the price? The problem gnawed at him as he split wood for the evening fire. Drying didn't work, not reliably. Not in this climate, with its wild swings between Arctic cold and the occasional Chinook wind that could raise temperatures 40 degrees in an afternoon, creating condensation and frost damage. But what else could a man do? You couldn't keep fresh berries through the winter. They'd rot in a week. Even here, where the cold could preserve meat for months, berries were too delicate. Their skins would split from freezing, turning them to mush when they thawed. Some men tried to make preserves, boiling the berries with sugar into thick jams. But sugar was expensive, had to be hauled in from Fort Laramie or beyond, and even then you needed proper jars with good seals, or the preserves would ferment or mold. Thomas had tried that his first winter. The crocks had frozen solid, and when they thawed in a warm spell in March, half of them had exploded from the pressure of fermentation, leaving a sticky, spoiled mess. Others had told him to just gather fresh greens when he could, even in winter. Pine needle tea, rose hips, the inner bark of certain trees, and yes, those things helped, but they weren't the same as the concentrated nutrition in berries. The Shoshone had told him that. The berries held something special, something powerful that kept a person not just alive, but strong. As the days passed, Thomas found himself thinking more and more about the native peoples he'd encountered. They didn't seem to suffer from scurvy the way the white trappers did. Oh, winters were hard for everyone, but the indigenous families he'd traded with always seemed to emerge from winter in better condition than the mountain men. They had knowledge, techniques passed down through generations, refined over centuries of living in this unforgiving land. He remembered a conversation from the previous spring with an old Crow man named Plays with Fire. They'd been sitting outside Thomas's trading post, sharing a pipe, when the subject of winter provisions came up. Plays with Fire had gestured to a group of women who were processing service berries on flat rocks near the creek. "You whites," the old man had said in his measured English, "you always want to make things small and hard. Dry, 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 like you're trying to kill the food before you eat it." Thomas had laughed at that, thinking it was a joke. But Plays with Fire hadn't been laughing. He'd been serious. "The berry," the old man had continued, "it wants to stay alive. Even when you pick it, it has water in it, yes, but that water is not the enemy. That water is what keeps the life inside. You take all the water out, you take the life out too. Then it is just," he'd searched for the word, "dead dust." Thomas hadn't understood at the time. But now, standing in his storehouse looking at his ruined supply, those words came back to him like an echo across the months. The berry wants to stay alive. The water is not the enemy. It went against everything he'd been taught. Moisture was the enemy. Moisture meant rot, mold, decay. You had to drive it out completely. That was the foundation of food preservation, as every settler and trapper knew it. But what if that thinking was wrong, or rather, what if it wasn't complete? Thomas began to pay closer attention to the world around him, not the world of men and their conventional wisdom, but the world of nature itself. He watched how the animals prepared for winter, how the land itself seemed to store its resources. One morning, tracking a deer through fresh snow, he came across a bearberry bush, its bright red fruit still clinging to the branches despite the brutal cold. They should have shriveled or fallen away, but there they were, glossy and plump under a coating of frost. He plucked one and examined it. The skin was intact, taut even, When he bit into it, the flesh inside was frozen solid, but it hadn't turned to mush. It was more like a sorbet, crystalline but holding its structure. How was that possible? These berries had been frozen and thawed multiple times over the past months. By all logic, they should be destroyed, their cell walls ruptured, their flesh turned to liquid. But they weren't. Thomas brought several branches of the bearberries back to his cabin and laid them out, studying them. When the berries thawed in the warmth of his fire, they remained intact. Softer than fresh, yes, but still recognizable as fruit, still edible. He tasted one. Tart, slightly mushy, but the flavor was there, the life was there. He thought back to plays with fire's words. The berry wants to stay alive. What if the key wasn't to remove all the water, but to preserve the berry in a state where the water couldn't cause decay? What if you could freeze them so quickly, so completely, that the structure remained intact? But there was a problem with that idea, and Thomas knew it. Freezing and thawing in an uncontrolled environment was exactly what had ruined food for centuries. You'd freeze something, then the temperature would rise, it would partially thaw, water would redistribute, bacteria would get a chance to work, and then it would freeze again, creating ice crystals that punctured cell walls from the inside. That cycle of freezing and thawing was a recipe for destruction, unless you could prevent the thawing. The thought struck Thomas like a revelation. What if you could keep the berries frozen, continuously frozen, without any thaw cycles, until you needed them? In the brutal cold of a Wyoming winter, maintaining a frozen state wasn't the challenge. The challenge was preventing temperature fluctuations. He thought about his storehouse. It was partially underground, which helped moderate temperature swings, but it was still connected to the outside air through the door and ventilation gaps. Every time he opened that door, warmer air rushed in. Every time the wind shifted or the sun hit the hillside at a different angle, the temperature inside changed. Those fluctuations were small, but they were enough to cause problems. What he needed was a place of perfect, unchanging cold. A place that would stay frozen solid from November through April, with no variation whatsoever. Thomas stepped outside and looked at the landscape with new eyes. The snow was 4 feet deep in places. Drifts against the north side of his cabin reached almost to the roof, and underneath that snow, insulated from both the sun and the wind, the temperature would be constant, right at or just below freezing. Not the wild swings of exposed air, but a steady, reliable cold. But snow wasn't solid. Moisture could still penetrate it. Animals could dig through it. He needed something more secure. Then he remembered the ice. Every winter, the creek that ran below his trading post froze solid by December. Not just a thin skim of ice, but a thick, dense layer that grew from the bottom up as the water kept flowing beneath and freezing in layers. By January, that ice was often 3 feet thick or more. It was dense enough to walk on, clear enough to see through in places, and most importantly, it maintained a perfect temperature of 32 degrees Fahrenheit right at the freezing point. Not colder, which could cause damaging ice crystal formation in the berries. Not warmer, which would allow decay. Exactly at that boundary line where water and ice coexisted. Thomas felt a surge of excitement. This was it. This was what he'd been searching for. But he couldn't just dump his berries into the creek and hope for the best. He needed a system, a way to store them in the ice that would protect them from the water underneath, keep them organized, and allow him to retrieve them throughout the winter without disturbing the entire cache. He spent the next several days working on his idea. Using an old crosscut saw, he cut blocks of ice from the creek, each one about a foot square. He carved shallow depressions into the top surface of each block using a chisel, creating small bowls about 2 inches deep. Then he gathered what fresh berries he could find that were still hanging on the bushes, frozen but intact. Rose hips, bearberries, a few late-season juniper berries. Not much, but enough to test his theory. He placed the berries carefully into the carved depressions, spreading them in a single layer. Then he took another block of ice and pressed it down on top, creating a sealed chamber with the berries frozen inside, completely surrounded by solid ice. He repeated this process, stacking the blocks to create a tower of ice with berries trapped in layers throughout. The construction looked almost like masonry, blocks fitted together with frozen berries preserved in the mortar. Thomas wrapped the entire structure in several layers of burlap, then buried it in a snowdrift on the north side of his storehouse, where the sun would never reach it directly. The snow would provide insulation against any warm winds, while the ice would maintain its perfect temperature. It seemed too simple, too obvious. If this worked, why hadn't anyone else figured it out? But then Thomas thought about the conventional wisdom he'd been fighting against. Most trappers and settlers came from places where winter freezing was a problem, not a resource. They thought of ice as the enemy, something that damaged food. The idea of using it as a preserving medium was counterintuitive to everything they'd learned. But the native peoples, they understood ice differently. Thomas remembered watching Crow families in the fall preparing for winter. They didn't just dry and smoke their food. They had multiple strategies, different techniques for different foods. And now that he thought about it, he'd seen them pack certain things in snow or bury them in frozen ground. He'd assumed they were just trying to keep animals away. But what if there was more to it than that? Winter deepened. January gave way to February, and February dragged toward March. Thomas carefully rationed his dried foods, supplementing them with pine needle tea and whatever small game he could trap. The weakness hadn't set in yet, but he could feel his body crying out for something more. His old injuries ached more than usual. His concentration wavered. Small cuts took longer to heal. Then came the test. In the second week of March, a Chinook wind roared down from the mountains. The temperature, which had been holding steady below zero, suddenly shot up to 40 degrees. Snow began to melt in rushing cascades. Icicles fell from the eaves like daggers. Thomas's heart sank. This was exactly the kind of temperature swing that destroyed food. His dried berries had been ruined by far less extreme fluctuations, but he forced himself to wait, to trust his system. The snow drift where he'd buried his ice blocks was on the north side, away from the direct force of the warm wind. The insulation of snow and burlap would slow any temperature change, and the thermal mass of all that ice would resist melting, at least for a while. The Chinook lasted 3 days. When it finally broke and the cold returned, Thomas dug into the snowdrift with trembling hands. The outer layer of snow had melted and refrozen into a crusty shell, but as he dug deeper, he found the snow still powdery and dry. And when he reached his ice blocks, they were solid. A little water had formed on the surface where the warm air had penetrated, but the structure itself was intact. He pulled out one of the blocks, brushed away the frost, and used his axe to carefully split it open. Inside, frozen in their crystalline chamber, were the berries. He extracted a handful and brought them into his cabin to thaw by the fire. As they softened, Thomas hardly dared to breathe. If this didn't work, if they'd turned to mush or developed that horrible freezer-burn taste, then all his theorizing had been for nothing. He picked up a bearberry and bit into it. The texture was softer than fresh, certainly. The skin was slightly mushy, but the flavor burst across his tongue like summer itself, tart and sweet and alive. Not the dead, dusty remnant of his dried berries, but something with vitality, with essence, with that ineffable quality that his body needed so desperately. Thomas ate another and another. He could feel something in his body responding, some deep cellular recognition that this was what it had been crying out for. The berries weren't perfect. They weren't exactly like fresh fruit, but they were so far beyond anything he'd managed to preserve before that they might as well have been miraculous. Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas carefully managed his ice-preserved berries, taking out only what he needed and keeping the rest frozen solid. He ate them slowly, letting his body recover from the early stages of scurvy. His gums pinked up. His energy returned. The fog that had been settling over his thoughts lifted. But the real test came in late March, when a late-season blizzard roared in, one of the worst Thomas had seen. The temperature plummeted to 30 below zero and stayed there for a week. Snow fell continuously, adding another 3 feet to the already massive drifts. Thomas was trapped in his cabin, unable to even make it to his storehouse for supplies. This was the scenario that had killed Jacques Moreau and countless others. Trapped inside, living on dried meat and meal, slowly succumbing to malnutrition while the winter raged outside. But Thomas had prepared for this. Before the storm hit, he'd brought several of his ice blocks into his cabin's cold room, a small insulated chamber he'd built off the main structure. As long as he didn't heat that room, the blocks would stay frozen even inside. During that week of confinement, Thomas ate from his ice-preserved berries daily. He'd also brought in some of the bearberry branches that still clung to frozen fruit, and he alternated between his processed berries and these natural ones. The combination kept him not just alive, but healthy. By the time the storm broke and he could dig himself out, he felt stronger than he had in months. Word of Thomas's survival spread when spring finally arrived. Other trappers had fared poorly that winter. 3 men hadn't made it at all, found dead in their cabins when the thaw came. Others emerged gaunt and weak, many with the telltale signs of scurvy. But Thomas looked healthy, almost robust. At the spring rendezvous at Fort Bridger, men wanted to know his secret. At first, he was reluctant to share. Knowledge was valuable in this country, and techniques that gave you an edge could mean the difference between profit and poverty, life and death. But as Thomas looked around at the faces of men he'd known for years, men who'd shared their own hard-won wisdom with him, he knew he couldn't keep this to himself. He explained his method slowly, carefully, knowing that most of them would think he was crazy at first. The idea of intentionally freezing berries flew in the face of everything they knew. Freezing damaged food. Everyone knew that. But Thomas explained the difference. It wasn't just freezing. It was continuous freezing, without any thaw cycles. It was using ice itself as a storage medium, maintaining that perfect temperature right at 32 degrees. It was working with water, rather than trying to eliminate it completely. Some of the men scoffed, just as Thomas had expected. "Ice is ice," one old-timer said. "It'll ruin the berries just like it ruins everything else." But others listened with growing interest. These were men who'd learned the hard way to question conventional wisdom, who'd survived by observing and adapting. They understood that the frontier demanded new solutions, that the old ways didn't always work in this unforgiving landscape. A young trapper named William Morrison was particularly intrigued. He'd lost his own berry supply that winter and had barely survived on pine needle tea and sheer stubbornness. "Show me," he said simply. Thomas did better than that. He took Morrison and several others back to his trading post and showed them his remaining ice blocks, still preserved in the snowdrift, even though it was now early April. He split one open and distributed the berries. The men tasted them with expressions of surprise. "I'll be damned," Morrison said. "They're actually good." "Not just good," Thomas corrected. "They're alive. That's the key. You're not eating preserved food. You're eating frozen food. There's a difference." That summer, Thomas taught the method to anyone who would listen. He showed them how to select the right berries, how to prepare the ice blocks, how to layer and seal them, how to insulate the cache properly. Some of the trappers tried it. Others stuck with their drying methods, unwilling to put in the extra work or trust something that seemed so counterintuitive. But those who adopted Thomas's technique found that they sailed through the following winter with their health intact. Their berry supplies lasted not just through the winter, but all the way until fresh fruit appeared in spring. They could eat the frozen berries straight, or thaw them to use in pemmican, or boil them into a warm sauce that made dried meat palatable. The method spread gradually, passed from trapper to trapper, adapted and refined. Some men created elaborate ice houses, dug into north-facing hillsides, and lined with sawdust for insulation. Others kept it simple, like Thomas, using snow and burlap. The specific techniques varied, but the principle remained the same: continuous freezing, no thaw cycles. Use the ice as your friend, not your enemy. Thomas's Shoshone wife, Wintermoon, returned that spring and brought with her something that made him laugh out loud. Her grandmother had sent a gift, a traditional method the Crow and Shoshone women had used for generations. It involved packing berries in hide pouches, sealing them with rendered fat, and burying them in deep snow or frozen ground. Essentially, Thomas realized, the same principle he'd discovered, but refined over centuries. "You whites?" Wintermoon said with a smile that reminded him of plays with fire. "You always have to figure everything out the hard way." Thomas had to admit she was right. The knowledge had been there all along, held by people who'd lived in this land for generations. He'd just been too caught up in the conventional wisdom of his own culture to see it. But that was the thing about survival on the frontier. It demanded that you set aside your preconceptions. It required you to observe, to question, to learn from everyone, including and especially those who thought about the world differently than you did. The ice preservation method became one small piece in the larger puzzle of frontier survival, passed down through the decades. As more settlers moved west, as trading posts became towns and towns became cities, the technique evolved. Soon people were using ice houses and sawdust packing. Later, they'd discover mechanical refrigeration and eventually electric freezers. But the principle remained the same, the principle that Thomas Brennan had learned the hard way in that brutal winter of 1841. Freezing wasn't the enemy. Freezing was a tool, a way to pause time, to hold on to summer's abundance through winter's scarcity. But only if you did it right. Only if you understood that the goal wasn't to kill the food, but to preserve its life, suspended and waiting, until you needed it again. Now, sitting by his fire as winter deepened once more, Thomas thought about that journey of discovery, about how close he'd come to following the same path as Jacques Moreau and so many others, about how a chance conversation with an old Crow elder had planted a seed that took months to germinate into understanding. The frontier had a way of humbling a man, of teaching him that his cleverness meant nothing compared to the accumulated wisdom of those who'd come before. The native peoples hadn't survived in this harsh land by accident. They'd observed, experimented, refined their techniques over countless generations. And they'd done it without the baggage of conventional wisdom that told them freezing was bad, that moisture was the enemy, that the old ways were the only ways. Thomas had learned to set aside his assumptions and look at the world with fresh eyes. To ask not, how do we preserve food back home, but how does nature preserve itself? The bearberry bush didn't dry its fruit. It didn't smoke them or pickle them. It simply held them, frozen and waiting, until the spring. That lesson extended beyond berry preservation. It was about approaching every challenge with humility and openness. It was about understanding that the solution to a problem might come from the most unexpected place, from a culture you didn't understand, from an observation that contradicted everything you'd been taught. In the years that followed, Thomas became known not just as a successful trapper, but as someone willing to experiment, to try new things, to blend knowledge from different sources. He learned to preserve different foods using different methods, each one suited to the particular characteristics of that food. Meat, he discovered, could be frozen just like berries, though you had to be more careful about wrapping it to prevent freezer burn. Some vegetables worked well, others didn't. Root crops did better, buried in cold sand. Grains needed to stay completely dry. Every food had its own requirements, its own preservation method that worked best. The key was to observe, to experiment, to be willing to fail and learn from those failures. The key was to never assume you had all the answers. And when other trappers came to him for advice, Thomas always told them the same thing. Don't just learn the technique, he'd say. Learn the thinking behind it. Learn to observe. Learn to question. Learn to combine what you know with what others know. That's what keeps you alive out here. Not any single trick, but the willingness to keep learning. The ice-preserved berries became his example, his teaching tool. He'd show new trappers his cache. explain the method, and then he'd push them further. Now, he'd say, what else could you preserve this way? What other problems could this solve? Don't just copy what I did. Think about the principle and apply it to your own situation. Some got it, some didn't. But those who did, those who understood that frontier survival was about adapting and observing rather than rigidly following rules, those were the ones who thrived. They were the ones who made it through hard winters, who built successful trading posts, who eventually helped settle this wild country and make it, if not tame, at least livable. As Thomas aged, he saw the frontier change. The great days of the mountain men were coming to an end. Beaver was trapped out in many areas. Railroads were creeping westward. Towns were sprouting where once there'd been nothing but wilderness. The world was moving on, as worlds always do. But the lessons remained. The ice house behind his trading post, now expanded and refined, still held its treasures through the winter. Locals came to trade for his frozen berries, knowing they were getting something special, something that connected them to the abundance of summer, even in the depths of winter. And sometimes, sitting in that ice house in the middle of January, looking at the careful layers of ice and berries stacked like frozen history, Thomas would remember that desperate February morning when he'd stared at his ruined provisions and felt the first touch of scurvy in his bleeding gums. He'd remember the decision to look beyond conventional wisdom, to observe nature, to learn from those who knew better. That moment had changed everything, not just for him, but for countless others who'd benefit from the knowledge he'd share. One simple trick, people called it. But it wasn't simple at all. It was the result of observation, experimentation, humility, and a willingness to learn from unexpected sources. The berry frozen in its chamber of ice wasn't just food. It was a lesson in suspension, in preservation, in patience. It taught that sometimes the answer to a problem wasn't to fight against natural forces, but to work with them. Winter wanted things frozen? Fine, work with the freezing. The berry wanted to stay alive? Find a way to preserve that life rather than killing it to preserve the shell. These were the principles that mattered, not the specific technique of ice caching, but the thinking that led to it, the observation, the questioning, the synthesis of different knowledge traditions, the willingness to look foolish trying something new. And that, Thomas realized in his later years, was what the frontier had really taught him. Not how to trap beaver or preserve berries or build a cabin. Those were just skills, useful but limited. What the frontier had taught him was how to think like someone who expected to survive, to approach each problem fresh, without assumptions, to learn from everyone and everything, to understand that the world was far more complex and wonderful than any single person's understanding could encompass. The ice-preserved berries were still sitting in their cache, waiting for spring, but they were also sitting in the memories and practices of dozens of trappers and traders scattered across the high country. Some of them didn't even know where the method came from anymore. It had just become part of the collective wisdom of the mountains, and that was how it should be. Knowledge wasn't meant to be hoarded, it was meant to be shared, tested, refined, passed on. The native peoples had understood that. Their knowledge was collective, accumulated over generations, belonging to the whole community. Thomas had learned to think that way too. And so the simple trick of keeping berries fresh through winter became something more. It became a story about observation and humility, about questioning conventional wisdom, about learning from those who thought differently, about working with nature instead of against it. These were lessons that extended far beyond food preservation. They were lessons about how to live in a challenging world, how to thrive in harsh conditions, how to find solutions that others had missed because they were too locked into their preconceptions. The frontier was closing, but the frontier spirit, that willingness to observe and adapt and learn, that could live on, that had to live on. Because the world would always present new challenges, new situations where the old solutions didn't work. And in those moments, people would need to remember how to think like Thomas had learned to think. Look at what's actually happening, not what you expect to happen. Question the conventional wisdom. Learn from unexpected sources. Combine different knowledge traditions. Experiment. Fail. Learn from the failure. Try again. And above all, stay humble. Stay curious. Stay open to the possibility that the answer you need might come from the last place you'd think to look. That was the real lesson of the ice-preserved berries. Not the technique itself, but the journey to discover it. The willingness to admit that the old way wasn't working. The courage to try something that seemed foolish. The wisdom to learn from those who knew better. The persistence to keep refining the method until it worked. These were the qualities that separated those who merely survived the frontier from those who thrived on it. These were the qualities that built not just individual success, but entire communities, as knowledge was shared and refined and passed forward. And so, as winter deepened, and the ice thickened on the creek, and the berries lay frozen in their carefully prepared caches throughout the mountain country, that knowledge rippled outward. Each person who learned the method became a teacher for others. Each successful winter became proof that new ways were possible. Each thawed berry in the middle of February became a small victory over the tyranny of conventional thinking. The frontier demanded such victories. It rewarded those who could adapt, who could observe, who could learn. And it remembered in its own way the lessons of those who came before, not always in written records or formal histories, but in the practices that persisted, the techniques that worked, the knowledge that kept people alive and healthy through impossible conditions. Thomas Brennan's name would fade from memory, as most names do, but his method would persist, evolving and adapting as methods do, becoming part of the bedrock knowledge of mountain survival. And somewhere in that knowledge, that practice of freezing berries in ice and eating them fresh in February, would remain the echo of a lesson learned the hard way. That observation matters, that conventional wisdom isn't always wise, that the answer you need might be right in front of you if only you're willing to see it with fresh eyes. That nature itself is the best teacher if you're humble enough to learn. That knowledge from different traditions can combine to create something new and better. That the frontier isn't just a place, but a state of mind, a willingness to question and experiment and discover. These lessons frozen and preserved like berries in ice, waiting for each new generation to rediscover them in their own way, on their own terms, in response to their own challenges. That was the real gift of the frontier, the real wisdom that Thomas Brennan and countless others like him had to offer. Not a simple trick, but a way of thinking, a way of seeing, a way of being in the world that acknowledged its complexity, respected its challenges, and met them with humility, curiosity, and an unshakable determination to find a better way. And in the end, that was worth more than all the frozen berries in all the ice caches in all the mountain country of the American frontier.